The date was August 16, 2005. It was deep into the night, and a ferocious storm was raging across the skies of Venezuela. Cruising at 33,000 feet, a passenger jet, West Caribbean Airways Flight 708, was making its way through the darkness. Everything seemed routine. The passengers were asleep, and the crew was looking forward to going home. But in the span of just a few minutes, the atmosphere inside the cockpit transformed from calm routine to absolute chaos. Pilots were screaming. Alarms were blaring. The captain was shouting that the engines had failed. The first officer was screaming that the plane was falling. And then, silence. 160 people. A modern aircraft. 2 experienced pilots. How does a fully functional airliner simply drop from the sky like a stone? Did the engines truly betray them? Or was there something else unfolding inside that cockpit, something invisible to the naked eye? Today, we are opening the file on West Caribbean Flight 708, one of the most tragic and mysterious accidents in aviation history. This isn't just a story about a crash. It is a story of stress, immense pressure, and a single, fatal error that wiped out everything in seconds. Our story begins at Tocumen International Airport in Panama. It was 1 a.m. Flight 708 was scheduled to fly from Panama to the island of Martinique. This was a charter flight, packed mostly with French citizens who had been vacationing in Panama and were now heading back home. But even before this flight pushed back from the gate, an invisible danger was already present in the cockpit. That danger was stress. West Caribbean Airways, a Colombian airline, was going through a severe financial crisis at the time. The situation was so dire that the airline didn't even have the money to pay its employees. The captain of Flight 708 was 40-year-old Omar Ospina, accompanied by a 21-year-old first officer, David Munoz. Investigators later discovered a shocking fact. These pilots had not received their salaries for the past 6 months. Just imagine the headspace of Captain Ospina. Despite being an experienced airline pilot, he was forced to work a second job at a bar just to put food on the table for his family. He was moonlighting to survive. When your mind is consumed by the anxiety of how to pay the rent or school fees, can your focus truly be 100% on flying? This was their 4th flight of the day. They were exhausted, frustrated, and angry at the airline's management. The flight was already delayed. The airline lacked credit for fuel, causing complications on the ground in Panama. When they finally strapped into the cockpit, they weren't just flying an airplane. They were carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. The aircraft they were commanding was a McDonnell Douglas MD-82. Known as the workhorse of the aviation world, it is instantly recognizable by its 2 large rear-mounted engines and its distinctive T-shaped tail. This aircraft was considered incredibly reliable. Thousands of MD-80 series planes were flying daily across the globe. Around 1 a.m., with 152 passengers and 8 crew members on board, Flight 708 took off from Panama. The plane was heavy, every seat was booked, and the cargo hold was packed to capacity with luggage. Captain Ospina ran the calculations and determined they were within safety limits, albeit barely. The weather was atrocious. August is the peak of hurricane season, and the intertropical convergence zone was active over the Caribbean. This meant massive thunderstorms, lightning, and severe turbulence. But for these pilots, this wasn't new. They were used to flying these routes. They thought they could simply climb over the weather and everything would be fine. The takeoff was smooth. The jet climbed into the night sky, turning towards its destination. No one on board had any idea that this journey would never be completed. After takeoff, the captain decided to level off at 40,000 feet, flight level 310. But as they progressed, the weather deteriorated. Turbulence began to shake the aircraft. To save fuel and attempt to top the storms, Captain Ospina made a critical decision. He would climb higher, to 33,000 feet. Here we need to understand a crucial technical concept. When an aircraft like the MD-82 is fully loaded, as it was that night, it becomes very delicate at high altitudes. At 33,000 feet, the air is very thin. To generate enough lift, the plane needs to fly fast. However, if it flies too fast, it hits aerodynamic limits, Mach tuck. If it flies too slow, it falls out of the sky. The narrow margin between these 2 speeds is known in aviation as the Coffin Corner. On top of this, it was freezing cold. The combination of rain and freezing temperatures meant ice could form on the wings. Ice is poison to an aircraft. It alters the shape of the wing, increases weight, and destroys lift. To prevent this, the pilots activated the anti-ice system. Voiceover, technical explanation visual. The MD-82's anti-ice system works by bleeding hot air from the engines and piping it to the wings and engine inlets to melt ice. But this comes at a cost. When you rob the engines of this air for heating, the engine's thrust, its pushing power, decreases. Simply put, turning anti-ice on means engine power goes down. Now, look at the scenario. The plane is heavy. The plane is at a very high altitude, 33,000 ftau in thin air. The engines are losing power to the anti-ice system. These three factors were combining to create a recipe for disaster. The captain turned the anti-ice on, but he made a fatal calculation error. He failed to account for the performance penalty that comes with the system. According to the manuals, at that weight and in those weather conditions with anti-ice on, the maximum safe altitude was 31,900 feet. But they were at 33,000 feet. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the aircraft began to bleed airspeed. But why didn't the pilots notice? Because the autopilot was engaged. The autopilot's job was to maintain altitude. As the speed dropped, the autopilot automatically pitched the nose of the plane up to generate more lift and keep them at 33,000 feet. The nose pitched up higher, the speed dropped lower, and the angle of attack increased dangerously. Inside the cockpit, the pilots weren't talking, perhaps due to fatigue, or perhaps due to the tension between them. The captain was in his own world, and the first officer sat in silence. There was one warning sign. The engine gauges showed the power was maxed out, EPR limits. Yet they weren't accelerating. Pilot, I can't accelerate. Suddenly, a massive updraft from the storm hit the aircraft. The wind shear robbed them of their last few knots of airspeed. The speed dropped below the critical threshold. And then the most terrifying sound in a cockpit erupted. Sound effect, stick shaker sound. Loud mechanical rattling. It was the stick shaker. The control columns vibrated violently. This is the plane's way of screaming at the pilots. We are going to fall. Stall! Stall! A stall does not mean the engine has stopped. A stall means the airflow over the wings has become turbulent and separated, and the wings can no longer generate enough lift to support the plane's weight. In this situation, there is only one way to survive. Nose down, make sure push the nose down. Use gravity to regain speed and then fly out of it. But what did Captain Ospina do? He did the exact opposite. He believed his engines had failed. A flame out. Why? Because when the plane stalled, the disrupted airflow caused the engines to hiccup and lose power. Momentarily, compressor stall desurge. The gauges dropped. The captain saw the gauges drop and entered. Tunnel vision. He was convinced the engines were dead. Dialogue recreated. Captain, flame out on both engines. Tell them we have a flame out. First officer, Captain, it's a stall. Look at the breakdown in communication here. The 21-year-old first officer Munoz realized it was a stall. He yelled, "It's a stall!" But the captain wasn't listening. He began trying to restart the engines, unaware that the engines were running fine. It was the wing that had stopped flying. The captain kept pulling back on the control stick. He wanted to keep the plane up, but this instinctual reaction only pinned the nose high. This locked the aircraft into a deep stall. The plane was no longer flying. It was falling like a dead leaf, flat and belly first towards the earth. The rate of descent? 12,000 feet per minute. They were plummeting at nearly 200 feet every single second. On the cockpit voice recorder, we hear First Officer Munoz contacting Air Traffic Control, ATC. Mayday, mayday. We have a flameout on both engines. We are falling! The Venezuelan ATC had no radar coverage in that remote area. They were flying blind. The controller kept asking, "What is your position? What is your altitude?" But the pilots had no time to answer. The gravitational forces inside the falling plane were so intense the pilots could barely move their arms. The vibration was so violent they couldn't read the instruments. The captain was still fixated on the engines. If he had just let go of the stick or pushed it forward, the nose might have dropped and they could have recovered. But human factors, lack of training, stress, and panic, had locked his brain into a fatal loop. First Officer Munoz, who likely knew how to save the plane, was too intimidated by the captain's authority to take control. He thought the senior captain must know what he was doing. This was a total failure of crew resource management. CRM. 3 minutes. It took just 3 minutes to fall from 33,000 feet to the ground. In the final moments, the pilots realized there was nothing left to do. The final words recorded were likely prayers or thoughts of their families. At approximately 3:01 a.m., West Caribbean Flight 708 slammed into a cattle farm in the Mexiques region of Venezuela. The aircraft impacted the ground and disintegrated instantly. There was a massive explosion and then nothing. There were no survivors. All 152 passengers and 8 crew members perished. When the sun rose and Venezuelan rescue teams arrived, the scene was devastating. Colonel Lawless Ramos, the lead Venezuelan investigator, arrived at the site and noticed the wreckage was confined to a very small area. This meant one thing clearly: the plane did not break up in mid-air. It fell intact. It fell in a flat spin or a vertical stall. Initially, politics clouded the investigation. Relations between Venezuela and the USA were tense. The Venezuelan government refused to hand over the black boxes to the American NTSB. They insisted on leading the investigation or using French assistance, since the victims were French. After intense diplomatic pressure, the black boxes were sent to France for analysis.
When investigators finally cracked the data from the black box, they were stunned. Everyone assumed the engines had failed, just as the pilot had claimed on the radio. But the flight data recorder told a completely different story. The engines were working perfectly. At the moment of impact, the engines were spooling at high rotation. There was no mechanical failure, no bad fuel. So why did the captain scream "flame out"? The investigative team drew their conclusions. Wrong decision? The captain's decision to take a heavy plane to 33,000 feet with anti-ice on. Lack of awareness. The autopilot masked the decaying airspeed until it was too late. The stall. When the stall occurred, the airflow disruption caused the engines to surge, confusing the captain. Incorrect recovery. Increasing power while pulling the nose. Yoop is the wrong way to recover from a high-altitude stall. The correct action was nose down. By pulling back, the captains sealed their fate. But the report didn't just blame the pilots. It put the airline on trial. West Caribbean Airways had not provided proper stall recovery training to its pilots. They were never taught how to handle a stall at high altitudes. Furthermore, the pilots' mental state, unpaid salaries, financial ruin, and fatigue had severely compromised their decision-making abilities. Following the release of the investigation report, West Caribbean Airways ceased operations. The airline went bankrupt and vanished into history. But this crash shook the aviation industry to its core. Several critical changes were implemented after this tragedy. Training. Pilots now undergo specific simulator training for high-altitude stalls. CRM, crew resource management. There is a renewed emphasis on eliminating the cockpit gradient if a captain is making a mistake. The first officer is trained and empowered to speak up and take control if necessary. Airline oversight. Regulators began scrutinizing the financial health of airlines more closely, recognizing that a bankrupt airline often compromises on safety. Today, when we board a flight, we feel safe. That safety is built on the lessons learned from tragedies like Flight 708. But that safety came at the cost of 160 lives. The story of West Caribbean. 708 serves as a haunting reminder that in the skies, there is no room for error. And sometimes, the greatest danger isn't the storm outside or the engines on the wing, but the fear and confusion within the human mind. Friends, this was the tragic story of West Caribbean Flight 708. What are your thoughts on this? Should the captain be held solely responsible, or does the blame lie with the airline that pushed them to the brink? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this detailed analysis informative, please like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you more documentaries like this. I'll see you in the next video with a new mystery. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.